The elusive quest for growth. Debates about how the numerous amount of efforts to remedy the extreme poverty in the third world have failed, even though different economists do agree that these poor countries in the tropics could reach the standards of living similar to the countries in Europe and North America. The reasons behind the failures of solutions such as foreign aid, investing in technology, improvements in education, controlling population growth, and making aid loans is that all of them neglect that individuals, businesses, governments, and donors respond to incentives. In other words, Easterly argues that the failure of economic development in poor tropical nations is not the failure of economics itself, but the failure to apply economic principles to the practical policy at work. So instead of just focusing on just the ideas on how to improve the life of the poor, his recommendations is to improve the institutions of governments and international actors to create incentives that promote growth. Why does growth matter? The first chapter establishes Easterly's reasons for focusing on the quest for economic growth. He starts by making the readers realize just what kind of poverty and unlivable conditions the people experience in Pakistan. 85% of them live on less than $2 a day, and 31% live in extreme poverty at less than $1 a day. The worst part is the majority of the world live in nations like Pakistan, experiencing poor sanitary conditions, a lack of electricity, no telephones, no running water, no roads, and a lack of access to medical care. All of these needs that poor people face lead to a high rate of infant mortality. In the richest fifth of the countries, the infant mortality rate is 4 out of every 1,000 births. But in the poorest fifth of the countries, the rate is 200 out of every 1,000 births. Researchers have also found that a 10% decrease in income is equivalent to a 6% increase in infant mortality rate. In the section Wealthier and Healthier, the Easterly explains the correlation about how the rise in income causes a fall in mortality rather than the other way around. He uses a study from Lant Pritchett and Larry Summers, who follow the trajectory of some income increases that were unrelated to mortality, like the export prices, and concluded at the end of this trajectory that infant mortality rate fell. High mortality in the poorest countries also reflects the continuing problem of hunger and bad nutrition. Some of the poorest families stay without food from 2 to 3 days or even the whole week. The author also emphasizes how poor nations, minorities are particularly disposed to oppression, and children are even more vulnerable. 42% of the children ages 10 to 14 are already working in the poorest countries, since less than 2% of the children in the same age groups are working in the richest countries. The saddest part is that some of the labor that children have to do in these poor countries implies prostitution and war. Women are also vulnerable to oppression in poor countries. Over 4 out of the 5 of the richest fifth of the countries have social and economic equality for women, while in the poorest fifth of the countries they have none. The last topic in the first section of the book is growth and poverty. Here's Easterly's colleagues from the World Bank, Ravalion and Chen, explain after a study of a series of data that the fast growth went with fast poverty reduction, and the overall economic contraction went with increased poverty. In Ravalion and Chen's data, measure of inequality shows no tendency to get either better or worse with economic growth. If the degree of inequality stays about the same, then income of the poor and the rich will be rising or falling together. That means that on average, growth has been much more of a lifesaver to the poor than a redistribution. Scary and impacting realities that Easterly shows us in the first part of the book makes us realize how poverty is not just a low GDP. But instead it means dying babies, starving children, and oppression of women and minorities in most parts of the world. Like he quotes, "The well-being of the next generation in the poor countries depends on whether our quest to make poor countries rich is successful." In the second part of the book, Easterly shows the fallacies and other proposed solutions, which he repeatedly refers to as panaceas. He presents the evolution of economic thought regarding growth and lists the many new panaceas and the reasons why they were not correct. He uses an example from when Ghana first came into existence. Economists thought this new nation's plans would result in a 7% per annum growth rate, but because many difficulties, it ended up in a complete failure and presented barely any growth after years of investments. Although he highlighted that the real disaster is that Ghanaians are still about as poor as they were in the early 1950s. Easterly linked the idea that aid-financed investments in dams, roads, and machines would yield growth. With the Harold-Domer model, Domer presented the model in 1946. The model discussed the relationships between short-term recessions and investments in the USA. Although he assumed that production capacity was proportional to the stock of machinery, 11 years later he stated that it made no sense for the long-run growth and that was not effective anyways. Regardless, many other economists continue to use and believe in this model for centuries to follow, which makes no sense if we consider that this model was not intended as a growth model and was disclaimed as a growth model over 40 years ago by its creator. In his efforts to promote investment and capital accumulation, Easterly admits that he was a user of this model at some point too, because the basis of this theory is the financing gap, which is the amount of the money a country should be investing in its capital minus the amount of money they actually are able to. The financing gap should be filled by aid from other countries to start the growth. Easterly also uses the Lewis model and Rostow's stage of growth, which also proposed that the GDP growth would always be proportional to the share of investments in GDP, and that capital accumulation was the critical factor for growth. These three models justify huge amounts of aid for the Western governments and intergovernmental organizations to fill the financing gap between domestic savings and requirement investment. However, through many examples and with the knowledge that nobody has checked the financing gap approach against actual experience, Easterly demonstrates that most aid did not go into investment in the years 1965 to 1995 and finds that no statistical association between investments and growth. So he concluded that the model should be laid to rest. The following chapter talks about Robert Solow, that is in the late 1950s discovered that it is not just an investment in machines, but an investment in ever-improving machinery. Technological progress that improves worker productivity in the long run. Easterly discusses the theory of capital-led growth and the belief that poorer countries will grow at a greater rate than wealthier countries and eventually catch up. This is known as convergence. He points out, while this sounds good in theory, it rarely happens in the real world, because growth is affected by many circumstances other than wealth. Easterly also discusses the failed efforts of states to use education, family planning, and the debt forgiveness as means to grow out of poverty. He explains that there is almost no incentives for a student in a poor country to value and invest in her or his own education if there is no future return for that investment. For education to provide a return on investment, the society must have a well-functioning institutions and markets that foster a demand for skilled individuals. Family planning is another important point, and it's well explained in Chapter 5, Cash for Condoms, where Easterly denied the myth that controlling population is a means for increasing growth. He discusses the incorrect assumption that additional people simply reduce the average GDP per person and does not consider that these people can create additional GDP and perhaps increase the GDP per person. In other words, Easterly is saying that the additional children means more future taxpayers who can help pay for existing governmental programs. The main reason Social Security is financially troubled in most rich countries is that population growth is slowed. He also emphasizes in the more babies there are, the greater it is likelihood that one of them will grow into a Mozart, Einstein, or Bill Gates. Michael Kramer did a simple test that supported Easterly's theory. Kramer found out that the higher initial population means more idea creations, more people to use the idea, and more people to share the fixed costs of implementing the idea. The benefits of society then should make possible the support of more new babies. Easterly argues that the growth and development is the best contraceptive or means of decreasing population growth. For last, the author ends the chapter by concluding that each country has to decide on its own whether to increase population is putting an intolerable strain on natural resources, or whether an increase in population is a fertile breeding ground for new tax revenues and new babies. Easterly also highlights in the chapter the loans that were, the growth that wasn't. The problematic nature of structural adjustment loan programs, aid given under certain circumstances, which became very popular in the 1980s. The idea that countries get aid based on their financial reform is an inefficient way of giving aid, because instead initiating true economic reform, nations only pretend to adjust their policies, so they would have an increase in loans and donors would show little interest in canceling aid. Any country that puts away the future to fit today's requirements for aid will receive that aid at a sacrifice for future growth. Countries that received the most aid seem to grow the least, and countries which were probably the most deserving received the least. Easterly proposed that it would be more efficient if they tie aid to past countries' performance, not promises, so the country's government would have a real incentive to pursue growth-creating policies. The last chapter of the second part of the book is Forgive Us of Our Debts. The campaign to forgive the debt is Jubilee 2000. The World Bank and IMF already have a program, the Highly Indebted Poor Countries Initiative, to provide debt forgiveness for poor countries and with good policies. So the final panacea that failed is debt relief. Easterly spends the chapter showing that debt of these countries was not bad luck, and the unprotected preference of debtors for high debt may simply lead to new borrowing to replace old canceled debts. Debt relief may also have perverse incentive effects, as countries borrow in anticipation of debt forgiveness. High debt may remain a problem simply because it reflects irresponsible governments that remain irresponsible after debt is granted. To conclude the second part of the book, Easterly suggests that the debt relief program can make sense if it meets two conditions. It's granted that there has been a proven change from an irresponsible government to a government with good policies, and second, it is once for all measure that will never be repeated, meaning that each country will have one chance to remove their debt.